Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing about the chapter digestion. Under that, mainly we'll be studying about the absorption of proteins, carbohydrates, lipids and hormonal control of the digestion and absorption. So as in our previous classes we have already discussed about the different types of enzymes and the gross anatomy of the digestive system including glands and organs. So as continuing with the absorption of carbohydrates, proteins and lipids. So in your lower classes also you might have studied about the how the digestion takes place in different parts and how they are absorbed. So here in small brief I will tell in this picture the carbohydrates, they are broke down or break down and they give into monomers, mainly glucose, galactose, fructose, sucrose, but the last product will be the glucose itself. And lipids, they are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Proteins, they give out into amino acids. So let's see in detail how the absorption of carbohydrates, proteins and lipids takes place. So the first one is about the carbohydrates. So as I have mentioned, so carbohydrates are absorbed in the form of the monosaccharides. So here the monosaccharides may be in the form of glucose, galactose, fructose, mannose and pentose also. So now the glucose and galactose, they are more or the maximum absorbed. So the estimated rate, as you know, it is around 120 grams per hour. So there what happens, they are transported through the plasma membrane. So in the plasma membrane, so that time what happens, the transportation, it takes place and epithelial cells by the common protein carrier, that is secondary active transport. So that carrier protein, it is also called as CGLT, sodium dependent glucose transporters. So when the sodium dependent glucose transporters, they bind for the glucose and another of the sodium ion. So here in this picture you can see how the CGLT, that is the sodium dependent glucose transporter, the carrier of the protein has two binding sites which includes glucose and sodium. So now the sodium and glucose, what they do, they carry the protein or then the carrier proton, they move towards the cytoplasm. Towards the cytoplasm they move, and once the cytoplasm is they are moving towards the cytoplasm, there sodium and glucose, they are facing towards the cytoplasm. Now glucose and sodium, they are released. Once they are released, glucose moves along the cytoplasm, diffuses into the blood. So once they are diffused into the blood, the sodium is transported back into the lumen, that is sodium potassium pump. So through sodium potassium pump it comes back. So what happens, glucose is absorbed into the lumen and sodium is released back into the main position. So this is how the absorption of carbohydrates, it takes place. So next, the absorption of protein. So protein is mainly absorbed in the form of what? Amino acids. So amino acids mainly here around 95 to 98% they are digested and absorbed in the small intestine. So once the small intestine is absorbed, or the mainly in the duodenum and ileum, the maximum amount of absorption takes place. But as you can see, they are transported by the active transport. So you know what do you mean by active transport and passive transport. So active transport is nothing but energy is needed, passive transport, energy is not needed. So during this transportation, what happens, the carrier protein present in plasma membrane of intestinal cells, they help in the transportation. So the carrier protein, it is also having two binding sites, one for amino acid and one for sodium. So what happened in the carbohydrate, same thing it happens, but here the binding with the amino acid and sodium, the carrier protein move towards the cytoplasm, which brings the sodium ion, and amino acid, it faces the cytoplasm when both sodium and amino acids are released into the plasma membrane. So once the releasing of the plasma membrane takes place, then what happens? The sodium is transported back by the sodium potassium pump. So this is simultaneously transported by using co-transport or sim transport, or you can call symport also. So during the transportation of amino acid is against the concentration gradient. So this gradient, which helps in the transportation of sodium, is along with the different types of gradient, mainly rapidly gradient or actively gradient. So this is how the absorption of protein that takes place in the small intestine. So next, coming to the absorption of lipids. So lipid, it intakes mainly fatty acids and glycerol, but where it happens? It happens in the lumen of intestine and into the blood. So absorption of lipid mainly occurs in intestine. The fat is digested into fatty acids, glycerol and triglycerides, but that time the lipids are transported in two routes, mainly venous blood and lacteal blood. But free fatty acids, what they are mainly up to 12 types, they are less than carbon. So usually they transport to the portal blood. And fatty acid with 14 or more than 14 carbons, they are transported to the lacteal forms. So during that transportation, the products of fat digestion, they are absorbed in intestinal cells, that is lumen of the intestinal cells. But here what happens? As you can see in the picture, the fatty acids and monoglycerides, what they do? They leave the micelles and enter the epithelial cells. But how this micelle formation takes place? So these micelles are nothing but they are the monoglycerides to form the minute complex of what? Of mainly the fatty acids, bile salts, and in the presence of lecithin. So that time micelles will be formed. And these micelles take up the lipid soluble and transport them into brush border of intestinal cells. So brush borders are mainly help in the absorption. And during that time the passive diffusion takes place and the separated bile salt move into the lumen. So once the bile is moved into the lumen, the transportation of fatty acids and monoglycerides into the brush border, it starts. So the micelles move down along the concentration gradient. So now what happens? The mucosal surface, it is getting the mucus or the micelles. Now the free cholesterol formed from the cholesterol esters are taking the action of the ester and enters the cell and they are re-esterified. So this is how the transportation of mainly lipids takes place. So this is about the absorption and transportation of carbohydrates, lipids and the proteins. So next, moving to one more concept. So this is in the summary how the absorption takes place. Next we'll move on to the hormonal control. So you need to remember about three different types of hormone, that is gastrin, secretin and CCK. So here, as you can see in the hormones of gastrointestinal tract, how they move and how the stimulation takes place. These are two types. One is positive feedback mechanism and one more is negative feedback mechanism. So now the endocrine system, what it is mainly present, it controls our releasing of hormones. So during the gastric phase, the hormone gastrin is secreted by G cells and this gastrin stimulates the release of the stomach acid, that is hydrochloric acid. Once the hydrochloric acid are released, that time the stomach is emptied. The acid environment needs to be maintained by the hormone called as somatostatin. So that stops the release of hydrochloric acid. So this is how the reaction it takes place inside the gastrointestinal tract due to the hormonal balance. The gastric inhibitory peptides, they are also secreted by the small intestine which slow down the peristaltic movement. So peristaltic movement is nothing but wave-like movement which helps in the movement of food. So there fatty food move from the digested and it will be absorbed. and once they are absorbed, and later it will start with the digestion process. So this is how the hormones are controlling our digestion. Remember, gastrin, secretin and CCK. So these are the three important hormones which control our digestion. So in this session mainly we have studied how the absorption of carbohydrates, proteins and lipids takes place, and the three main hormones, how they are controlling our gastrointestinal tract. So that's all about this session. Thank you.